The history of America and Cuba is deeply intertwined, spanning centuries of complex interactions from colonial times to the early 20th century. Early colonial interactions. Christopher Columbus first landed in Cuba on October 28, 1492, claiming the island for Spain during the colonial period. Cuba was a Spanish possession, with significant strategic importance in the Caribbean as the 13 North American colonies gained independence. Trade between the newly formed United States and Cuba began to grow. Annexation attempts and diplomatic tensions throughout the 19th century. The United States showed considerable interest in Cuba. In 1823, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams articulated a vision of Cuba naturally gravitating towards the United States. President James Polk even offered $100 million to purchase Cuba from Spain in 1848, which was declined. Spanish-American War and U.S. occupation. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked a crucial turning point in U.S.-Cuba relations. The war resulted in Spain's withdrawal from Cuba, and the United States occupied the island from 1898 to 1902. During this period, the U.S. established a military government and implemented significant political changes, including creating new administrative departments and maintaining many Spanish colonial governance structures. Key diplomatic developments. 1818. Spain opened Cuban ports for international trade, especially with the United States. 1819. The U.S. acquired Florida from Spain. 1898. The Spanish-American War transferred control of Cuba from Spain to the United States. 1902. Cuba gained formal independence, though under significant U.S. influence. The relationship between America and Cuba during this period was characterized by economic interests, strategic considerations, and a complex dynamic of potential annexation and eventual independence. The Spanish-American War was a pivotal moment in Cuba's journey to independence, fundamentally transforming the island's political landscape. The conflict effectively ended Spanish colonial rule and set the stage for Cuba's emergence as a republic, though with significant U.S. influence. Key impacts on Cuban independence. The war resulted in several critical developments. Spain relinquished control of Cuba after centuries of colonial rule. The United States established a military government in Cuba from 1898 to 1902. Cuba became a republic in 1902, but under substantial U.S. control. U.S. intervention and the Platt Amendment. While Cuba gained nominal independence, the United States imposed significant restrictions through the Platt Amendment. This amendment, incorporated into the Cuban Constitution, gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to ensure stable government. Cubans widely viewed this as an infringement on their sovereignty, and most provisions were repealed by 1934. Long-term consequences. The war transformed Cuba from a Spanish colony to a U.S. protectorate. Despite the initial promise of independence, Cuba remained heavily influenced by the United States, with the U.S. maintaining significant political and economic control over the island. In the early 20th century, the Platt Amendment profoundly undermined Cuba's sovereignty, creating a lasting framework of U.S. control that extended well beyond its initial implementation. Key long-term consequences. The amendment severely restricted Cuban independence by limiting Cuba's ability to enter international treaties, granting the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs at will, establishing the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, which remains under U.S. control today. Political and economic impact. The Platt Amendment effectively transformed Cuba into a de facto U.S. protectorate. It forced Cuba to integrate these restrictive provisions into its own constitution, creating a system of dependent sovereignty. The United States could intervene militarily to protect Cuban independence, oversee Cuban government finances, prevent Cuba from forming diplomatic relationships with other nations. Psychological and nationalist tensions. Cuban nationalists deeply resented the amendment. Many viewed it as a form of political subjugation, with Cubans feeling they were being treated like children by the United States. The amendment created a complex dependency where Cuban politicians sometimes strategically used the threat of U.S. intervention to manipulate domestic politics. Duration and eventual modification. The Platt Amendment remained in force until 1934, when both countries agreed to cancel the most restrictive treaties. However, its legacy of U.S. influence in Cuba continued to shape the relationship between the two nations for decades to come. The Platt Amendment profoundly disrupted Cuba's domestic political landscape by creating a system of dependent sovereignty that fundamentally undermined Cuban self-governance, political manipulation, and dependency. The amendment created a complex political environment where Cuban politicians could manipulate U.S. intervention threats to advance their own agendas. The United States gained the right to intervene in Cuban affairs unilaterally. Cuban political leaders were effectively reduced to wards of the United States. Sovereignty limitations. The amendment imposed severe restrictions on Cuban independence, prohibited Cuba from entering treaties with other foreign powers, allowed U.S. intervention to protect Cuban independence, gave the U.S. control over Cuban economic and foreign policy. Psychological and nationalist impact. Cuban reactions to the amendment were overwhelmingly negative. Most Cubans viewed it as a humiliation of their national sovereignty, creating deep-seated resentment toward the United States. Historians note that Cubans were shocked at the tightness of the bonds imposed and widely protested the amendment. Long-term consequences. The Platt Amendment ultimately created a paradoxical situation where U.S. attempts to ensure stability actually generated political instability. By 1933, Cuban revolutionary leaders argued that the amendment had been responsible for political, economic, and social evils plaguing the country. The amendment remained in effect until 1934, when President Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy led to its repeal. Though its legacy of U.S. influence continued to shape Cuban politics for decades, the Platt Amendment profoundly transformed Cuba's economic landscape, creating a system of deep economic dependency on the United States' economic control mechanisms. The amendment established several critical economic constraints, restricted Cuba's ability to enter international trade agreements, gave the United States significant oversight of Cuban financial policies, enabled extensive U.S. economic penetration of the Cuban economy, investment and economic domination. American economic influence expanded dramatically under the amendment. By the early 20th century, 40% of the Cuban economy was controlled by U.S. citizens. This control was particularly pronounced in the sugar industry, which became a cornerstone of Cuban-American economic relations. Trade and tariff dynamics. A critical economic development was the trade treaty negotiated by President Estrada Palma, which provided a 20% tariff reduction for Cuban sugar exports, granted similar tariff reductions for U.S. goods entering Cuba, tightened economic links between the two nations. One long-term economic consequences the amendment's economic provisions led to increased American corporate presence in Cuba. More than two-thirds of Cuban imports supported by American companies. A deep sense of economic resentment among Cubans. By 1934, when the amendment was repealed, it had fundamentally reshaped Cuba's economic sovereignty, creating a relationship of economic dependency that would have lasting repercussions. The Platt Amendment dramatically expanded U.S. economic presence in Cuba, creating unprecedented opportunities for American investment and control economic transformation. American investments in Cuba increased vastly under the amendment, with a remarkable 40% of the Cuban economy eventually controlled by U.S. citizens. This economic penetration was not accidental, but a deliberate strategy to secure American commercial interests. Investment mechanisms. The amendment facilitated U.S. economic expansion through several key strategies. Restricted Cuba's ability to enter international treaties, guaranteed U.S. market access for Cuban sugar exports, provided legal framework for American corporate involvement, established conditions to attract U.S. investors, including sanitation and health care initiatives. Strategic economic control. President McKinley and subsequent administrations viewed the amendment as essential for protecting U.S. economic interests. They feared that without direct oversight, Cuba might become economically unstable or vulnerable to other foreign powers' long-term consequences. By 1934, when the amendment was repealed, the economic landscape of Cuba had been fundamentally reshaped. The U.S. had transformed Cuba from a Spanish colony into an economic protectorate, with American business interests deeply embedded in the island's economic infrastructure. The Platt Amendment severely restricted Cuba's ability to sign international treaties, effectively stripping the country of its full diplomatic sovereignty. Treaty limitations. The amendment imposed strict constraints on Cuba's international agreements, prohibited Cuba from entering any treaty with foreign powers, forbade agreements that could potentially jeopardize Cuban independence, gave the United States the exclusive right to intervene if such treaties were considered threatening. Specific diplomatic restrictions. Under the amendment, Cuba was explicitly prevented from negotiating treaties that might impair its independence, allowing foreign powers to use Cuban territory for military purposes, entering international compacts without U.S. approval. Practical consequences. The treaty restrictions meant that Cuba became a de facto U.S. protectorate. The Spanish-American War fundamentally transformed Cuba's path to independence, though not entirely on Cuban terms. While the war ended Spanish colonial rule, it also established significant U.S. control over the island. Key impacts on Cuban independence. End of Spanish rule. The war resulted in Spain withdrawing from Cuba, effectively terminating nearly 4 centuries of colonial control. This marked a critical milestone in Cuba's long struggle for independence, which had begun with the 10 Years' War in 1868. U.S. intervention and limitations. Despite the war's promise of independence, the United States imposed substantial restrictions on Cuban sovereignty. The Platt Amendment of 1901 gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, establish a naval base in Cuba, limit Cuba's international negotiations, prevent Cuba from transferring land to other foreign powers. Formal independence. Cuba officially became a republic in 1902, but under significant U.S. influence. The U.S. occupation force remained until Cuba incorporated the Platt Amendment's provisions into its constitution. Long-term consequences. Most of the Platt Amendment's provisions were repealed by 1934, but the war fundamentally reshaped Cuba's political landscape, transforming it from a Spanish colony to a U.S. protectorate. The Treaty of Paris of 1898 fundamentally shaped Cuba's path to independence, but with significant limitations imposed by the United States. Key provisions for Cuba. Spain formally relinquished all claims of sovereignty over Cuba. The treaty officially granted Cuban independence. However, Cuba was prevented from participating in the peace talks and treaty signing. U.S. control and restrictions. The treaty set the stage for prolonged U.S. intervention through several critical mechanisms. A U.S. occupation force remained in Cuba for more than 3 years. The U.S. would only withdraw after Cuba incorporated the Platt Amendment into its constitution. 6. The Platt Amendment allowed the U.S. to intervene in Cuban affairs, establish naval bases, notably Guantanamo Bay, limit Cuba's international negotiations, prevent Cuba from transferring land to other foreign powers. Long-term implications. While nominally independent, Cuba was effectively brought into the American sphere as a quasi-protectorate. The treaty transformed Cuba from a Spanish colony to a U.S.-controlled territory, fundamentally altering its path to true self-determination. The Treaty of Paris thus represented a complex moment of both liberation and new forms of colonial control for Cuba. Cuba was excluded from the Paris peace talks, despite being the central conflict of the Spanish-American War due to the United States' strategic political maneuvering. Although Cuban forces had significantly contributed to the liberation efforts, the U.S. deliberately prevented Cuban representatives from participating in the negotiations. Key reasons for exclusion. The U.S. sought to maintain direct control over Cuba's post-war trajectory. Cuban representatives were not allowed to participate in the treaty signing. U.S. General William R. Shafter even refused to let Cuban General Calixto Garcia participate in the surrender ceremonies in Santiago de Cuba. Consequences of exclusion. The Treaty of Paris did not set a designated time limit for U.S. occupation. The Isle of Pines was excluded from Cuban territory. Cuba's independence was technically granted, but under significant U.S. constraints. This exclusion set the stage for prolonged U.S. intervention in Cuba, effectively transforming the island from a Spanish colony to a U.S. protectorate, with Cuban sovereignty severely limited by subsequent measures like the Platt Amendment. The exclusion of Cuba from the Paris peace talks had profound and lasting consequences for its independence, effectively transforming the nation's path to sovereignty into a form of controlled liberation. Key impacts of exclusion. Cuba was denied direct representation in negotiating its own future. The United States gained unilateral control over Cuba's post-war trajectory. Cuban military leaders, like General Calixto Garcia, were prevented from participating in surrender ceremonies. 3 specific consequences. The Treaty of Paris did not set a designated time limit for U.S. occupation. The Isle of Pines was explicitly excluded from Cuban territory. The U.S. established a protectorate status over Cuba, overseeing its constitutional and governmental formation. Long-term implications. From 1899 to 1902. Cuba's independence was effectively managed under U.S. protection. General Leonard Wood directly supervised the creation of a Cuban government that closely mirrored the U.S. political system. On May 20, 1902, the U.S. transferred power to the democratically elected Cuban President Tomas Estrada Palma, but with significant ongoing U.S. influence, the exclusion from peace talks ensured that Cuba's independence was not truly self-determined, but rather a carefully managed transition under U.S. control. The exclusion from the Paris peace talks profoundly shaped Cuba's international relations, fundamentally limiting its sovereignty and setting the stage for decades of external control. Immediate consequences: Cuba was prevented from directly negotiating its own independence terms. The United States effectively became Cuba's primary external arbiter. Cuba was transformed from a Spanish colony into a U.S. protectorate. Long-term international impact: the exclusion led to significant diplomatic challenges. Cuba was forced to accept U.S. intervention through the Platt Amendment. The country was strategically isolated from traditional diplomatic channels. Cuba was excluded from the Organization of American States, OAS, in 1962, further constraining its international engagement. Diplomatic adaptation: in response to these limitations, Cuba developed a foreign policy characterized by anti-U.S. sentiment, seeking alliances with socialist and communist countries, developing relationships with Soviet Union, China, and later Venezuela, positioning itself as a supporter of national liberation movements. By the 1990s, Cuba had strategically reoriented its international relations around 7 core goals, including survival of the Castro Revolution, increasing global influence, and reducing U.S. impact. The exclusion from the Paris peace talks thus became a pivotal moment that fundamentally shaped Cuba's complex and defiant approach to international relations throughout the 20th century. The exclusion from the Paris peace talks fundamentally shaped Cuba's foreign policy strategies, compelling the nation to develop innovative and defiant diplomatic approaches. Key strategic adaptations: Cuba became increasingly isolated after losing direct negotiation power. The country sought alternative international alliances to counterbalance U.S. influence. Cuba developed a strategy of forming relationships with non-Western powers. Diplomatic reorientation: Cuba's foreign policy evolved through several critical phases. In the 1970s, Cuba attempted to lead the non-aligned movement after the Soviet Union's collapse. Cuba pivoted towards Latin American socialist governments. The country developed strong relationships with Venezuela, Bolivia, and other left-leaning nations. International collaboration strategies: providing medical and civilian assistance to over 20 countries, developing close ties with Russia, China, and Venezuela, opposing the Washington Consensus through strategic alliances, maintaining relationships with countries traditionally opposed to U.S. interests. Long-term consequences: the exclusion from peace talks forced Cuba to become diplomatically creative, transforming its foreign policy from a potential U.S. protectorate to an independent, strategically positioned nation that actively challenged traditional international power structures. By 2025, Cuba continues to maintain its distinctive approach to international relations, characterized by selective engagement and resistance to U.S. diplomatic norms.